Oakville, Washington. A town so quiet, so unassuming, it could be any town in America. The kind of place where people wave as they drive by, the kind of place where neighbors are friendly and kids play freely in the yard. Nestled on Bartle Road, 177 is just another house. To the outside world, it's the same as any other. A modest home with an overgrown lawn, a little picket fence, a few tired windows. You could drive by and never think twice. It seems like the sort of place where nothing bad could ever happen. But what was hidden behind those walls, in that house, was something so devastating that when it finally came to light, it shook not just Oakville but the entire nation. The house at 177 Bartle Road is where little Oakley Carlson's life was meant to begin, but instead, it's where the nightmares began. Oakley was born on December 6, 2016, in this seemingly ordinary house. A baby girl with chestnut hair, brown eyes, and a smile that could light up a room. She was the third of 4 children in a home where chaos had become the norm, where addiction and neglect seemed to run in the veins of her family, poisoning everything around her. Her mother, Jordan Bowers, had already faced the harsh consequences of her actions, 5 prior convictions for theft and drugs, and had lost custody of her oldest son years before. Her father, Andrew Carlson, once a police officer, was now just a shadow of the man he used to be, having destroyed his career with his own choices. This house, this quiet, unremarkable place, was where Oakley spent her first few months of life. It was here, behind closed doors, that Oakley's story truly began. A story marked by broken promises, systemic failures, and a secret so dark, it would be nearly impossible to comprehend. What happened in that house doesn't make sense, and yet it is tragically real. It forced us to question everything we believe about keeping our children safe, about the very people we trust to protect them, and about the systems that should be safeguarding the most vulnerable among us. Today, Oakley's family is still desperately searching for answers. Still waiting. Still hoping that somewhere, someone will bring them the truth that's been hidden for far too long. But the most haunting question remains unanswered. If this could happen here, how many other houses like this one exist, hiding secrets that will never be uncovered? As we dive into this story, I need your help. Every like, every subscription, and every share of this video is a chance for another child to find the safety and love they deserve. Share this story, leave your city and viewing time in the comments. It's important for me to know where people are ready to protect children. This is not just about one tragic case, it's about how we can all do better. Oakley Carlson was born on December 6, 2016 in Oakville, Washington, a tiny town where everyone knows your name, and the kind of place where things are supposed to be safe. But Oakley's birth wasn't like other babies' arrivals. It wasn't a celebration of new life and hope. No, Oakley was born into a world where hope had long been a stranger. Her first breaths were taken in a house where the very foundation of her existence was already fractured, where addiction, neglect, and violence cast long shadows over her future. Her mother, Jordan Bowers, had already walked a road filled with mistakes. A road marred by criminal convictions and a life that had spiraled out of control. Jordan's struggles with addiction had already cost her one child. In 2014, she lost custody of her oldest son, another casualty of a life lived at the edge of destruction. Jordan's battles with drugs and theft weren't just something she faced in the past. They were part of the fabric of her life. She had never truly gotten clean, never truly gotten the help she needed. Instead, she continued to spiral, carrying Oakley into a world that was anything but safe. Then there was Andrew Carlson, Oakley's father. A former police officer from Aberdeen, Andrew once wore the uniform of authority, the one that commanded respect. But that respect had faded long ago, burned away by his own decisions. A career in law enforcement ruined by his own substance abuse and personal demons. Once a man who protected and served, he was now another casualty of a system he had once been part of, a broken man with a broken past. And together, Jordan and Andrew made a home, or rather tried to, for their children. But it wasn't a home in any traditional sense. It was a house filled with chaos, substance abuse, constant turmoil, and a dangerous mix of unresolved trauma that poisoned everything around it.
Look, I need to take a stone from me.
Oh, and so...
And he took his phone from you?
Yeah.
Did you have Andrew's phone?
Yeah. I was watching Coco Melon.
Okay.
And Andrew took it.
And then what happened?
And Jordan put him back in his bed.
And then Jordan put Andrew back in his bed?
Yeah.
Oh.
Did she hit him, Oakley?
Yeah, him dead, like, really hard, like,
Or
Jordan,
why did she hit him?
cause horrible was, he was being mean.
Why was he being mean?
Like, "Whoa!"
From the very beginning, Oakley's life was tainted by the instability that defined her parents' world. She was just a baby, but already she was surrounded by things no child should ever have to face. Oakley's earliest months were spent in a place where screams echoed through the walls, where dirty dishes piled high, and where the weight of addiction clung to every corner. There was no stability for Oakley in those early years, no sanctuary. Instead, there was neglect as her parents struggled to hold it all together, but failed at every turn. And while Oakley's tiny hands grasped for love and care, it was just out of reach. When she was just 8 months old, Child Protective Services received their first call. Someone had finally seen what Oakley was living in. The report said that Jordan was struggling with her mental health and was failing to get the proper help for her daughter. But nothing happened. No one came to investigate, no one checked on Oakley. The case was dismissed. Another call came in just a month later, this time about DC, Oakley's sister, who was being neglected. Another report of domestic violence in the home, another plea for help. But this time, CPS investigated. But by the time they came, it was already too late. Oakley and DC were removed from the home, but Oakley's journey through life had already been forever altered. What Oakley had already lived through at such a young age was too much for any child to bear. And this wasn't just her story, it was the story of so many children living in homes that seem like they should be safe, but are anything but. Oakley, barely a year old, had already been lost to a world of instability, a world where the people meant to protect her were the very ones who failed her. And while Oakley was being taken from the only home she had known, the question remained, how many more children like Oakley were out there, hidden in plain sight, facing the same chaos, the same neglect, the same neglectful parents who continued to slip through the cracks? This is a story about that failure, about the failures of the system and the people meant to protect the most vulnerable among us. And for Oakley, it was just the beginning of a much darker journey. It wasn't until June 2017 that the first call to Child Protective Services, CPS, came in, a call that could have changed everything. Someone had finally seen the cracks in Oakley's world, the cracks her parents worked so hard to hide. The report was clear. Jordan Bowers, Oakley's mother, was struggling with her mental health, and Oakley's sister, DC, wasn't getting the medical care she needed. But even with all the signs of neglect and instability, nothing was done. The case was dismissed without an investigation. Another month passed, and the chaos at 177 Bartle Road continued, but the cracks were deepening. Another call came in, this time reporting more disturbing details. Illegal substances in the house, more domestic disputes, and more neglect of the children. This time, CPS finally acted, but it was only after the second call. Still, it wasn't enough to undo the damage already done. At just 8 months old, Oakley and her sister DC were removed from their home. For Oakley, it was the beginning of an unknown future. For DC, it was another chance at safety. But what no one could have predicted was that Oakley's new life, one she deserved, would start in a place of love, warmth, and hope. Jamie, Joe, and Eric Hales, the foster family who would become Oakley's lifeline, lived in Elma, Washington, a town not far from Oakville. They had always dreamed of having a child to love, a child to care for, but never imagined they'd find that child under such tragic circumstances. From the very first moment Oakley came into their care, she made her mark on their hearts. Jamie and Joe, especially, were ready to give her everything she needed. Oakley, with her chestnut hair and brown eyes, seemed so fragile at first, like a tiny, helpless soul who needed more than just a roof over her head. She needed safety. She needed love. She needed a place where she could finally feel the warmth that had been missing from her life for so long. And Jamie, Joe, and Eric were more than ready to give her all of that and more. For Oakley, the shift in her life was immediate. It wasn't long before her laughter filled their home, her little feet pattered across the floors, and her infectious smile started to light up every corner of the room. Her first steps were a precious gift, a tiny, wobbly moment that felt monumental for Jamie, Joe, and Eric. It wasn't just her first steps that made her feel like a part of their family, it was her first words too. "Mama," she said one day, and then, "Daddy." For the first time in her young life, Oakley was surrounded by safety, routine, and people who cared about her in a way she had never known. Jamie and Joe were overjoyed to see Oakley grow and develop. Every new word, every new action, every new smile was a reminder that love could heal, that stability could foster growth, and that Oakley had a future ahead of her that was so full of promise. Oakley's world, once clouded with confusion and fear, was now filled with the small joys of childhood. She loved the outdoors, especially the summer when she'd splash in the pool and run barefoot across the yard, her giggles echoing in the fresh air. But what she loved the most, what truly captivated her, was winter. Snow enchanted her. She would run outside in her favorite rubber boots, her eyes wide with wonder as the snowflakes fell. It was a magical sight, a little girl discovering the world through fresh eyes, eyes that had never known such peace. The love from her foster family wasn't just a temporary fix. It was the steady foundation she needed to thrive. Jamie and Joe didn't just care for Oakley, they embraced her completely, making her feel like she was part of their family in every sense of the word. The three of us, Jamie would later say, referring to herself, her husband Joe, and Oakley, we finally felt like a complete family. Oakley's joy was contagious. She became a vibrant, outgoing child who loved to sing and dance. She had a special love for the Beach Boys song Barbara Ann, and whenever it played, she'd tap her feet and spin around with the kind of energy only a toddler could muster. She loved her loud shoes, tap shoes as she called them, and would march through the house, creating her own little world of rhythm and joy. Books were another great love of Oakley's. Her foster mom, Jamie, would often read to her before bed, and Oakley cherished these moments. She'd snuggle under the covers with a pile of books, sometimes falling asleep with her favorite one in hand. She loved stories like Brown Bear, and I Have Loved You Since Forever, the latter, a phrase she and Jamie would say to each other every single day. Oakley's love for reading was a beautiful thing to witness. By the time she was 3, Oakley was speaking in full sentences, asking questions, and showing a bright, compassionate intelligence. But more than anything, Oakley was a child full of love. She loved hugs. She loved people. She loved her life with Jamie, Joe, and Eric, her forever family. In this home, she was more than just a foster child. She was their little girl, and they were her parents. And for a time, Oakley finally got to experience the joy and security every child deserves. She had a chance to live, to laugh, to grow, and for the first time in her short life, she was safe. It seemed like Oakley had finally found her forever home, a place where she was loved and cherished. Her foster parents, Jamie and Joe, had given her the safety and care that had been so desperately lacking in her early life. But in the fall of 2019, just as Oakley was beginning to flourish, the unimaginable happened. Child Protective Services made the decision to return Oakley to her biological parents, despite everything that had happened before. Jordan Bowers, Oakley's mother, had never truly gotten better. Her addiction to illegal substances continued to rule her life, and the gambling that consumed her existence was never far from the surface. Jordan spent most of her time at the Little Creek Gaming Club, where the staff knew her name all too well. They watched her lose thousands of dollars each week, chasing a high that only brought her deeper into her own self-destruction. How could a mother so lost in her own demons care for the child she had already neglected for so long? How could Oakley, a little girl who had only just begun to experience what it meant to feel safe, be returned to this chaotic, broken home? And then there was Andrew Carlson, Oakley's father. A former police officer who had been kicked out of his own treatment program for domestic violence, Andrew was living a life marked by failure. His once promising career was long gone, destroyed by his own decisions. His addiction and emotional instability had left him a shadow of the man he once was. Still, he and Jordan were allowed to keep Oakley. The system, it seemed, had failed to see the depth of their dysfunction, and the consequences were about to be felt in ways no one could have predicted. By this point, Oakley's biological parents had already proven that they couldn't provide the stability she so desperately needed. Reports of neglect, substance abuse, and violent outbursts had been documented. Oakley had already been removed once, and the system had seen the way her parents were spiraling. Yet despite all the evidence, the decision was made. Oakley was to return to the very people who had already failed her.
Sense that she had been abused or neglected before she came to us.
She was just always happy, like tried to make everybody laugh.
Yeah.
Always, like, especially if she did make you laugh, then she would try harder.
She loved Mickey Mouse, so I can't tell you how many times we have heard the hot dog dance.
The hot dog dance is still burned in my head.
Yeah. And just like Daniel Tiger, princess movies. She loved to read. Brown Bear, What Do You See is one of her favorites.
Yeah. I Love You, Blanky.
I Love You, Blanky. I Loved You Since Forever. She could pretty much recite most of those books because we read them so often. She was super active, so we played a lot. We went to swim lessons at the Y.
Yep, and she was in dance.
Yes, so she took dance from my dance teacher, which was really special. And she took jazz the first year, which I don't think we could see any of her recital because of how hard we cried.
Right, yeah, I just couldn't see it. Had to watch the video later.
Yeah, and then she really wanted to be in a loud shoes class, though, which was
tap dance.
Which was tap dance.
And she was great with tap dance. I had a board that we'd set out, and she would practice, and she would just love to dance around in her loud shoes.
Yeah. Probably the biggest picture you can get of Oakley is that she was genuinely just a happy baby, happy kid. She loved us. Like, she always had her arm around us, or she was hugging on us. She couldn't just sit by herself and watch TV. She had to be in one of our laps or touching us somehow. So, yeah, good baby.
Jamie and Joe were devastated when they heard the news. They had become Oakley's parents in every sense of the word. They had watched her take her first steps, heard her first words, and had given her everything she needed to heal from the scars of her past. They knew Oakley, every little quirk, every laugh, every smile, and they loved her with a depth that only those who have truly cared for a child could understand. The decision to send her back to her biological parents felt like a death sentence to them. They knew what awaited Oakley, and it wasn't the love and care she deserved. Desperate to keep Oakley safe, Jamie, Joe, and Eric begged CPS to reconsider. They told them about the bruises Oakley had come back with after visits to her biological parents. They spoke about the fear in Oakley's eyes when she returned from their chaotic home. Jamie and Joe even testified that Oakley had expressed a fear of going back to her parents. But despite all their pleas, despite the warning signs that had been flashing for months, CPS made its decision. Oakley was not their daughter. The system told them that they had no right to intervene, that their love for Oakley wasn't enough to keep her in their care. Poverty isn't a reason to deny parental rights, the social worker had told them coldly. She's not your daughter. It was a gut-wrenching moment. How could this be the truth? Oakley had lived with them for 26 months, long enough for Jamie, Joe, and Eric to have become her real family. She had thrived in their care. And yet, the law, the very system that was meant to protect her, was sending her back to the very people who had failed her from the start. The coldness of that statement still haunted them. Jamie and Joe knew Oakley better than anyone. They knew her favorite books, her love for the outdoors, and how she'd light up every time someone would sing her favorite song. They knew her fear of being sent back to the chaos of her biological parents' house. Yet, in the eyes of the system, none of that mattered. Oakley's bond with them wasn't enough to keep her safe. On November 29, 2019, Oakley was handed back to Jordan and Andrew Carlson. The very people who had once caused her so much harm were now her legal guardians once more. And it wasn't just that they were handed back their daughter, it was the way Oakley was handed back to them. No one seemed to notice the signs. No one seemed to care about the bruises Oakley had come back with after visits, or how she cried when they left Jamie and Joe. Oakley was taken from the only home she had ever known, the only place where she had felt truly safe, and given back to the people who had already hurt her. The system's failure was now complete. And for Oakley, the nightmare was just beginning again. When Oakley was returned to her biological parents in November 2019, the world she had known, a world filled with laughter, safety, and love, was ripped away from her. The warmth and stability she had found with Jamie, Joe, and Eric were now distant memories. What she was sent back to was a home built on chaos, neglect, and a dangerous cocktail of addiction and emotional instability. The hope Oakley had clung to, the hope that she would finally find peace and security, was shattered in an instant. Her mother, Jordan Bowers, was consumed by her gambling addiction. The Little Creek Gaming Club was her second home, a place where she'd lose thousands of dollars each week, chasing a high she would never find. But it wasn't just her addiction to gambling that made her a danger to Oakley, it was her complete inability to care for her children. The house was a mess, a reflection of the neglect that ran rampant within its walls. Dirty dishes piled up in the kitchen, the refrigerator was nearly empty, and the floors were never swept clean. It wasn't just a house, it was a battleground. A place where survival had become the goal, not nurturing, not love. Oakley, who had once flourished in a home where she was valued, quickly became an afterthought in her biological parents' chaotic life. Jordan had no time for her. Oakley wasn't a priority. Her mother's focus was always on her next gamble, her next escape. Her father, Andrew Carlson, wasn't much better. A man who had once worn the badge of a police officer, he was now a shadow of his former self, a broken man. His addiction to drugs and his failure to meet basic parental duties made him just as absent as Jordan, even though he was physically present. Oakley was no longer the bright, curious child who loved to dance and sing. She was now a problem to be ignored, a constant reminder of a life that her parents could neither manage nor care for. As the days turned into weeks, Oakley's distress became more evident. She was no longer the same happy, lively little girl. The laughter that once filled the house was replaced by silence, the kind of silence that only exists when a child is afraid to speak. Her parents saw her as nothing more than a burden, something they could not manage alongside their addictions and their own self-destruction. The little girl who had once loved to read before bed, who cherished her favorite stories, now had no such luxury. There were no bedtime stories, no safe space to retreat to. Oakley's needs, emotional and physical, went unmet. What should have been a time of growth and learning, of love and care, became a time of fear and neglect. Oakley didn't just suffer emotionally, her physical well-being began to deteriorate too. She was neglected in ways that no child should ever experience. The bruises that had once appeared after visits with her biological parents now became a regular occurrence. She returned from one visit with scratches on her cheeks, her clothes dirty, her spirit broken. It was clear that Oakley's parents were not only neglecting her, they were causing her harm. And yet each time she came back from a visit, it was as if no one saw it. No one took action. Oakley's distress was evident in her behavior. She began to withdraw, becoming quieter and more anxious, the joy she once had slipping further and further away. She no longer played with the same enthusiasm. She no longer asked for her favorite books to be read to her. The child who once adored the snow and the outdoors was now afraid to leave the house. Her world had become smaller and smaller, and each day in that house felt like a day spent in a prison of neglect. Even when she tried to express her fears, there was no one to listen. There was no one to comfort her when she cried. The house itself became a reflection of Oakley's deteriorating well-being. The chaos at home was overwhelming. Jordan's obsession with gambling left her distracted and disconnected from her children, while Andrew's failure to take responsibility meant he was little more than a bystander. The house, once filled with the laughter of a young child, was now a place of tension, uncertainty, and neglect. Oakley was expected to fend for herself in a home that could barely care for the adults living in it. As the months passed, Oakley's emotional and physical needs grew more desperate. She was a child trapped in an environment that couldn't provide the love, safety, or security she desperately needed. The once vibrant little girl was now a shadow of herself, her body frail, her spirit shattered. What should have been a time for her to heal and grow was instead a time of suffering. She was hungry for attention, for love, for comfort, but it was all out of reach. And the system, the very system that was supposed to protect her, had failed her once again. This was the harsh reality Oakley was forced to live with, an environment where her needs were ignored, where the adults in her life were too consumed with their own struggles to even notice the pain she was enduring. The question that lingered in the air was the same one that had haunted Oakley from the moment she was returned to her parents. How much more could she endure before it was too late? The cracks in her world had grown so deep, it seemed impossible for her to ever find a way out. Oakley Carlson's world, once filled with laughter, safety, and love, would slowly slip into darkness after she was returned to her biological parents. What began as a terrifying shift in her life quickly escalated into a complete disappearance, a mystery that no one could fully understand, and a cover-up so meticulous, it seemed almost as if Oakley had never existed at all. It started quietly. Oakley's last confirmed sighting was in February 2021, when she was seen by a family member. That was the last time anyone could say with certainty that she was alive, that she was still in the world she once filled with joy. After that, she vanished. No one saw her again. Her foster parents, Jamie and Joe, who had loved her like their own, were the first to notice something was wrong. They had remained in contact with Oakley's biological parents, and when they received no word from her or any sign of life, concern turned into a creeping dread. It wasn't just the silence. It was the strange behavior of Oakley's parents, Jordan and Andrew. 4 months, they acted as if nothing had changed, as if their daughter was still in their care, even though all signs pointed to something far darker. When Jamie, desperate to know where Oakley was, asked Jordan about her, the answers were vague, inconsistent. "She's just sleeping," Jordan would say, or "she's grounded." But even when Jamie asked to see Oakley, those requests were met with excuses. "She's sick. She's with her grandparents." But the stories never added up. The lies became more frequent, more elaborate, and more desperate. As the days turned into weeks, Jamie and Joe knew something wasn't right. Oakley, the bright-eyed child who had once loved her life and her family, had vanished without a trace. The child who had once filled their home with joy was now missing, and all they had were excuses, delays, and an eerie silence from the people who should have been the first to care. On December 5, 2021, just one day before Oakley's 5th birthday, the truth began to unravel. School principal Jessica Swift had been in touch with Jordan about a visit Oakley had made to her school, but when she asked about Oakley, a chilling response came from DC, Oakley's sister. 6-year-old DC, her eyes filled with fear and confusion, whispered something that would change everything. Oakley's no more. There is no Oakley. That moment, that quiet admission, would be the first real clue that Oakley's fate was far darker than anyone had imagined. It wasn't long before the police were contacted, and on December 6, Oakley's 5th birthday, law enforcement arrived at the house to conduct a welfare check. What they discovered inside the home left them shocked. The house, which had once been a place of neglect and chaos, was now eerily empty. There were no signs of Oakley, no toys scattered around, no clothes, no personal belongings. Everything that had once marked Oakley's presence in the home had been wiped away as though she had never been there. The room where she should have been sleeping was empty, the bed untouched. The house had become a hollow shell, devoid of the child who had once made it feel alive. But it wasn't just the emptiness of the house that raised alarms, it was the strange behavior of Oakley's parents. When questioned about their daughter's whereabouts, they were evasive, providing contradictory answers that made no sense. Andrew Carlson claimed that Oakley had been with his parents, but when the police reached out to them, they had never seen her. No one knew where Oakley was and no one could explain why she had disappeared. Then came the most telling detail. 10 minutes after the police left their home, Andrew deleted all the data on his phone. It was a small action, almost imperceptible, but it sent a clear message. The parents were hiding something. Something so terrible, so dark, that they were willing to destroy evidence to keep it buried. The police knew they were on the verge of uncovering something far more sinister. When the police obtained a search warrant and combed through the house, they found more disturbing evidence. The stains on the blinds, biological stains, told a grim story of a child who had suffered. Forensics confirmed that the stains had come from Oakley. But even more chilling was the discovery that not a single item belonging to Oakley remained in the house. No clothes, no books, no toys. Everything she had ever known, her belongings, her life, had been erased as if she had never been there. It was as though someone had gone out of their way to scrub away every trace of her existence. The absence of Oakley's belongings wasn't just unsettling, it was proof. Proof that someone or something had actively worked to make Oakley disappear from their lives. The house, once filled with the sounds of a young child, was now empty, cold, silent, and devoid of any sign of life. The police's discovery sent shockwaves through the community. How could this happen? How could a child just vanish without anyone noticing? And more importantly, why had Oakley's own parents worked so hard to cover up her disappearance? The investigation into Oakley's whereabouts had just begun, but it was clear that something dark was lurking beneath the surface. The cover-up was well underway and the truth, about what happened to Oakley Carlson, was buried deeper than anyone could have ever imagined. The moment Oakley's disappearance became clear, it was as though a veil was lifted, revealing something no one could have ever imagined. The evidence that started to surface was disturbing, and the more the police dug, the more they uncovered a trail of lies and omissions that led to an unimaginable truth. What had started as a missing person case quickly became something far darker, sending shockwaves through the community and sparking a nationwide outcry. The police's search of the Carlson home revealed disturbing evidence. Evidence that left investigators and the public alike horrified. When they first arrived, the house appeared eerily empty, with no signs of Oakley's presence. But what they found upon further inspection was far more chilling. There were biological stains on the blinds, stains that forensic tests confirmed belonged to Oakley. A child's blood, a child's essence hidden away in plain sight. The stains were not just overlooked remnants, they were a clear sign that something terrible had happened within those walls. But it didn't stop there. The house, once filled with Oakley's belongings, was now bare. Not a single item of hers remained. No toys, no books, no clothes, nothing. It was as if someone had gone to great lengths to erase all evidence of her existence. The absence of Oakley's belongings was the most damning piece of evidence yet. In a home where Oakley had once thrived, her laughter echoing through the rooms, there was now nothing. The sight of her empty room, the untouched bed, and the hollowed-out space where her life had been, it was as if she had been completely erased. It was a carefully calculated cover-up, and it was clear that Oakley's disappearance was no accident. It was intentional. As the evidence mounted, the investigation deepened, and the public's reaction was swift and overwhelming. The news of Oakley's disappearance spread like wildfire. Calls for justice flooded social media, and protests erupted outside the courthouse as the public demanded answers. Oakley's story quickly became a rallying cry for those who felt the system had failed her, who believed the child protection system had ignored the warning signs and allowed her to slip through the cracks. People were outraged not just because of what had happened to Oakley, but because of how the system had failed her. How could Child Protective Services have returned Oakley to a home so clearly unfit for a child? How could Oakley's biological parents, who had already proven incapable of caring for her, be allowed to take her back? The public's anger reached a fever pitch, with countless social media campaigns popping up, all demanding justice for Oakley. Hashtags like #FindOakley and #JusticeForOakley flooded Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, as people from all walks of life rallied to find answers. The image of Oakley, smiling and carefree, haunted the online community. Her innocence became the symbol of the fight for justice, and people across the nation began asking themselves the same question: how could this happen? But it wasn't just the public who was desperate for answers. The police investigation turned into a deep dive into the troubling history of Oakley's parents. As investigators uncovered more details about the Carlson family's chaotic and abusive history, the scope of the tragedy began to take shape. Jordan and Andrew's history was littered with red flags: addiction, criminal activity, and a failure to care for their children. How had Oakley, a child already failed by the system, been sent back into their care? What was the real story behind her disappearance? Theories about what happened to Oakley began to emerge. Was she a victim of criminal activity, perhaps trafficked or sold to someone? The lack of any trace of her belongings raised the possibility that someone had taken her, that she had become part of some unspeakable crime. Or was she simply another victim of neglect? Did her parents, consumed by their own addictions and failures, let her slip away from their lives in a moment of carelessness? The more investigators uncovered, the more the theories piled up, each more chilling than the last. But no matter the theory, the one thing that became clear was this: Oakley was gone, and her parents were the last people who had seen her. The investigation began to focus on the timeline of Oakley's disappearance. Police discovered that after Oakley's last confirmed sighting in February 2021, she simply vanished. No one had seen her, no one had heard from her, and it was as though she had been erased from the world. Even more suspicious was the strange behavior of her parents. When the police arrived to conduct a welfare check, Andrew's reaction was telling. He couldn't even recall the address of his own parents' house when asked, a simple detail that raised immediate suspicions. And then, in the aftermath of the police visit, Andrew's attempt to delete all the data from his phone was an obvious attempt to destroy evidence. It was clear that the parents knew far more than they were letting on, and it was even clearer that they were hiding something. The more the investigation uncovered, the more the pieces began to fall into place. Oakley's disappearance was not an isolated incident. It was part of a larger pattern of neglect and failure. The same system that had been tasked with protecting her had failed her at every turn. The question wasn't just about where Oakley was, it was about how she had ended up in a situation so devastating, where even her own parents had become the very people who would erase her from existence. As the investigation continued, the public outcry only grew louder. People demanded that Oakley's parents be held accountable. They wanted to know how Oakley could disappear so completely, without anyone asking the hard questions until it was too late. The sense of justice grew stronger every day, and those who cared about Oakley refused to let her memory fade. The story of Oakley Carlson was no longer just a story about a missing child. It had become a symbol of systemic failure, of how the most vulnerable among us are too often ignored, too often erased. The search for answers for Oakley was just beginning. But for the public, the question was clear. How could this happen? And more importantly, what would it take to make sure no other child had to suffer like Oakley did?
So the Oakley-Carlson Act, or HB 1397, was really just a comprehensive way of making sure that children were protected once they were reunified in foster care.
Yeah.
With that, it was more connection of, who's checking in on that child. So doctors, teachers, family members. Also, it had more drug testing, so it'd be for up to 5 years.
Right.
And I think that while there was still some editing that could have happened on HB 1397, it didn't even get to that point. It was killed very early on in the legislative session.
Yeah, I think part of it, the reason why it didn't pass is that it was a first draft going through, and from what we've heard from other people, like legislation very rarely passes the first time it goes through.
So I went to testify for it, and right away I was basically told that it was not going to get to vote. Representative Tannison, she works with the Department of Children, Youth, and Families often, and I felt like it was probably a very big threat to have a bill that would almost hold social workers super accountable. A lot of the people that were against HB 1397 said it was too expensive. And that's really disheartening to me, knowing how much money we spend on other things, but we are not willing to spend it on quality social workers, drug testing, and ensuring the safety of children.
When Oakley was returned to her biological parents in the fall of 2019, the child protection system failed her in ways that no one could have predicted. And in the end, it allowed Oakley's life to slip away from the very people who should have protected her the most. It wasn't just one mistake, one moment of neglect. It was a systemic failure, a series of decisions that disregarded Oakley's safety and well-being. A system designed to protect children had instead failed Oakley in the most tragic of ways. Oakley's foster parents, Jamie and Joe, knew this all too well. They had fought for Oakley from the moment she came into their care, watching her grow, thrive, and bloom into the joyful, compassionate child they had always hoped to raise. They had watched as Oakley's life turned from one of chaos and neglect to one of love and safety. They had given her everything: stability, care, emotional support. They had poured their hearts into her, and Oakley, in turn, had blossomed in their care. But despite all of this, the system made a choice that defied logic, one that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The decision to return Oakley to her biological parents, parents with a history of addiction, neglect, and criminal behavior, was nothing short of catastrophic. How could the system, the very system tasked with keeping children safe, ignore the glaring red flags? Oakley had already been removed once from the home, and yet, despite the history of abuse, despite the continued neglect and instability, CPS chose to return her to the very environment that had already failed her. What was the reasoning? Why did the system believe that a child so clearly in danger could safely return to the people who had already harmed her? It wasn't just a failure of the system to protect Oakley, it was a failure to see her for who she truly was. A vulnerable little girl who needed love, support, and stability. Instead, she was treated as another case file, another statistic. The system had ignored Oakley's voice, her cries for help. Her biological parents, who had proven themselves unfit to care for her, were allowed to take her back without any real investigation or intervention. It was as if the system had forgotten about Oakley, about the signs that had been there all along. Jamie and Joe, Oakley's foster parents, were left in the wake of this failure. They had fought tooth and nail to keep Oakley safe. They had poured their love and energy into her, hoping against hope that the system would see the truth. But the truth had been ignored. The system had failed, and Oakley was once again sent back to a life of neglect and danger. When Jamie and Joe received the news that Oakley would be returned to her biological parents, they were devastated. They knew deep down that the decision was a death sentence for Oakley. How could the system allow this to happen? How could they take Oakley from the only home she had ever known, the only place where she had felt safe? Despite the heartbreaking setback, Jamie and Joe refused to give up. They couldn't. Oakley's memory, her smile, her love, they wouldn't allow it to be lost. They began their fight for justice not just for Oakley but for every child who had ever been failed by the system. Their advocacy for Oakley's law became their mission, a fight to ensure that no other child would be sent back into a home so clearly unfit to care for them. Oakley's case became a symbol for the brokenness in the child protection system, and Jamie and Joe vowed to make sure that Oakley's voice, even in her absence, would never be silenced. They fought to bring awareness to the deep flaws in the child protection system, speaking out about the systemic failures that had allowed Oakley to be sent back into harm's way. They knew that if they didn't speak out, Oakley's memory would be reduced to just another statistic, and the failures of the system would be swept under the rug. They worked tirelessly, gathering support from others who had been affected by the system, from social workers to child advocacy groups, all coming together to demand change. But even as the fight for Oakley's justice continued, the investigation into her disappearance remained open, and the search for answers pressed on. Law enforcement, still reeling from the discovery of the empty house, continued to pursue leads. Oakley's biological parents, Jordan and Andrew, were still the primary suspects, but the truth remained elusive. How had Oakley gone missing without anyone noticing? How had she been erased from the very house she once called home? Investigators began piecing together the evidence, following the strange behavior of Oakley's parents. The deletion of phone data, the lies, the inconsistent stories, they all pointed to something much darker. It was as if Oakley had been deliberately removed from their lives, her presence erased as though she had never existed. But why? What had happened to Oakley? And who was truly responsible for her disappearance? The police's investigation was a slow, painstaking process, with no clear answers in sight. The timeline of Oakley's last known sighting, the strange behavior of her parents, and the complete lack of physical evidence all raised more questions than they answered. Yet through it all, Jamie and Joe refused to back down. They held on to the belief that justice for Oakley was still possible, even if the system had failed her. They knew that the truth would eventually come to light, and they were determined to ensure that Oakley's story would not be forgotten. Despite the continued search for Oakley and the ongoing investigation, the public outcry did not fade. People were still demanding answers, still calling for justice. Oakley's name became a symbol of the fight for reform, for a system that truly protected children, for a future where no child would ever be failed like Oakley had been. The investigation continues, but Oakley's foster parents, along with countless supporters, remain steadfast in their fight for justice. They continue to call for reforms, for Oakley's law, and for a world where children are no longer treated as collateral damage in a broken system. And through it all, the memory of Oakley, the laughter, the love, the joy, remains a beacon for those still searching for the truth.
For our call to action, we have worked with a really great advocacy group called Light the Way. They're amazing. One of them was just out here for a couple days, and they have worked day and night to find justice for Oakley, and not just Oakley, but missing people all around the United States. We ask for people to contact Governor Jay Inslee because he's never addressed the situation. He's never said Oakley's name. He's never written back to us, which we've contacted him multiple times. Unfortunately, Patrick Dowd, who works as ombudsman, he doesn't think there were any wrongdoings in Oakley's case, which there very much were, and we know that there were. So we are asking Governor Jay Inslee for an outside secondary investigation into Oakley's case. We feel that there were many wrongdoings, and we believe that it should be an unrelated investigation office that looks into Oakley's case. Our next one is to contact Ross Hunter, which Ross Hunter is the very ill-equipped person in charge of DCYF. He has done multiple interviews where he said that he's really uncomfortable, which that makes me laugh a little bit because I'm like, you're uncomfortable? Right. But he also is refusing to take any accountability in DCYF and how it is ran. And so on Light the Way's website, there is a template that you can use too if you don't know what to say. But just contacting Governor Jay Inslee and Ross Hunter and kind of putting that pressure on those people to really take accountability for Washington State DCYF and make sure that people that are in charge of children are actually like helping children and not.
Where is Oakley? Where is Oakley? Where is Oakley? Where is Oakley? Where is...
The battle for Oakley Carlson's justice was far from over. Despite the overwhelming public outcry, the legal struggles continued to mount, and the fight to make real change within the child protection system seemed almost insurmountable. Oakley's case became a symbol, not just for one little girl's tragedy, but for a system that had failed her, and so many others, at every turn. One of the most painful setbacks in the fight for Oakley's justice came when Oakley's Law, a piece of legislation designed to prevent children from being returned to unsafe homes, failed to pass. Despite the tireless efforts of her foster parents, Jamie and Joe, who had poured their hearts into advocating for this law, it was blocked by bureaucratic red tape, political inertia, and a system more focused on protecting itself than protecting children. The law would have mandated stricter regulations and more rigorous checks before a child could be returned to a dangerous environment, but it never saw the light of day. For Jamie and Joe, it was a bitter blow. They had hoped that Oakley's memory could be honored through lasting change, but the failure of the law felt like yet another betrayal of the little girl they loved. It wasn't just the fact that Oakley had been returned to her biological parents in the first place. It was the system's refusal to acknowledge its own flaws, its inability to recognize the danger that Oakley was in, even when the signs were glaringly obvious. The system had failed Oakley at every step, and now, even in death, it was refusing to hold itself accountable. But even in the face of this crushing defeat, Jamie and Joe refused to give up. Oakley's memory could not, and would not, fade into the shadows. They continued their fight not just for Oakley but for every child who had been failed by the very systems meant to protect them. They organized campaigns, raised awareness, and kept Oakley's face in the public eye through digital billboards, posters, and social media. They knew that Oakley's story had to be told, that her memory had to be kept alive so that her death would not be in vain. The digital billboards became a symbol of their resolve. Oakley's smiling face on display across the state, a constant reminder of the child who had been lost to a broken system. Every time someone passed a billboard, they were reminded that Oakley's life mattered, that her memory had not been erased, and that her story had to be heard. Through social media, Jamie and Joe reached thousands of people, sharing Oakley's story and calling for justice. They shared photos of Oakley's smile, her love of books, her joy in the simple things, and with each share they hoped someone would listen, someone would finally take notice. It was a long, painful process, but the efforts were not in vain. Oakley's story began to gain traction, and public support grew stronger. People from all walks of life rallied behind the cause, demanding change, demanding accountability. A movement started to build around Oakley's memory, a movement focused not just on justice for Oakley, but on ensuring that no child would ever be subjected to the same neglect and abuse. The failures of the child protection system could no longer be ignored. Jamie and Joe's fight for reform became a beacon for those who had lost faith in the system, a call for those in power to finally listen and take action. They fought for changes to the way child protective services operated, for stricter guidelines around the return of children to dangerous homes, and for more rigorous oversight of parents with histories of abuse and neglect. Their efforts were relentless, but they knew that change wouldn't come easily. It never does. But Oakley's case wasn't just about her. It was about every child who had ever slipped through the cracks, every child who had been failed by a system that was supposed to protect them. Jamie and Joe knew that if Oakley's death could lead to real, lasting change, then perhaps, just perhaps, Oakley's life would have meant something more than just the tragic loss of a little girl. Her memory could spark a revolution within the child protection system, one that could prevent future tragedies and ensure that no other child would be sent back into harm's way. As they continued to advocate for reform, Jamie and Joe found solace in knowing that Oakley's story was far from forgotten. Her face, her voice, her memory lived on in the fight for justice. The public support was unwavering. The outrage over Oakley's case was not just about her disappearance, it was about the systemic failures that allowed it to happen. People demanded change, and they demanded it now. Oakley had become the face of a broken system, a system that could no longer hide behind its flaws. In the final push for reform, Jamie and Joe continued to carry Oakley's memory like a torch, illuminating the path for change. They knew that the fight wasn't over, and they wouldn't rest until the system that had failed Oakley was held accountable. They had lost Oakley, but they hadn't lost the fight. And as long as they breathed, they would continue to push for the reforms that could one day save a child from suffering the same fate. For Oakley, for every child, and for a better future, Jamie and Joe fought on. The fight for justice, for reform, for Oakley's legacy, would never end.
We have a lot of frustrations with DCYF, probably too many to name, but it seemed like a recipe for disaster for the children to be returned how they were. I can't imagine being a recovering addict and having a newborn baby and a toddler and a child with special needs and an older child all returned.
It went from no kids in their care to having 3 kids full time.
Yeah. It sounds like recipe for disaster. They knew they were going to fail, but they didn't follow up on them. So there were no drug tests, there were no check-ins, and I think that it's kind of easy to see how Oakley was able to slip through the cracks when she's not being followed up on. The case was closed by June of 2020. So even though there weren't visitations, the social worker signed off on Oakley and her siblings being permanently placed with her family. Everything was just so rushed. We don't understand why it was rushed, especially after having her for almost 3 years. and then returning so quickly. We do know that when I called in January of 2021, that services were offered by a DCYF social worker to Jordan and Andrew, and they basically said no, which to me is a red flag. I think if you are extending services when you see that somebody is struggling and they decline and they seem hostile about it, that should be a red flag. My other complaint or another frustration is that when I called and was kind of chided that I called in January, it made me feel stupid for calling in. And I shouldn't feel stupid for calling in about a child's welfare, especially as a mandated reporter. And so in November, I felt even more stupid for calling and raising a concern. I also emailed the social worker, which I emailed the social worker and I sent her pictures of the GoFundMe. I was just ignored, which when I sent those pictures to the social worker, I could tell that she had accessed them because she had to request access to look at them, and she did, but I never heard anything from her. Feeling like I was completely ignored, I also asked 2 other people to please call in the CPS about the fire, and they never heard either. So our state's DCYF is very, they're ignorant.
They're lacking.
They're lacking. I think that there are good social workers, but in our case, I feel like we had the worst of the worst. And to even explain even more about that is that we requested an investigation. We begged for one. I put in information into the Ombuds office, which they are kind of like the cousin to a state agency where they kind of investigate any complaints. And even though there are a million pieces of evidence where we know that Jordan and Andrew did things that DCYF should have put as a red flag, unfortunately, they chose to go ahead and ignore that and say that there were no wrongdoings with Oakley's case. I honestly think that had Washington DCYF listened to us, I guarantee you Oakley would be running around right now. So for some context, in about June of 2019, we had been asked by the social worker if we would be interested in possibly taking Oakley's younger sibling once he was born. Mm-hmm. And we were like, yes, definitely. And that all kind of came crashing down in about a month. We don't know a lot about what happened because we're the foster parents and you don't get a lot of that information. But at the very beginning of Oakley and her siblings going into foster care, the social worker didn't do something that she was supposed to do. Like she was supposed to take the stand or she was supposed to present something.
Yeah, there was, at a hearing, she didn't give evidence or give testimony or something like that. I'm not sure of the details.
Oakley's biological mom, Jordan, contested that. It went to 2 different courts and she ended up winning, which that meant that everything in foster care was basically negated. And even though she'd spent over 500 days with us, the courts now saw it as she had entered foster care as day 1. So it reset the clock on everything. So July of 2019, we get a call from our CASA. Now your CASA is a court-appointed special advocate, and they are supposed to be the person that kind of fights for your child in court and says this is what should be going on to the judge. We met ours twice.
I think he came to the house, I think only twice.
Yeah, if that. And we saw him at court a couple times, but definitely not somebody to be fighting on Oakley's behalf because I don't think he really knew anything about her.
No.
And so anyways, he called me in July of 2019 and I know exactly where I was when he called and he said, well, you did the best that you could. Maybe next time just don't get so attached. And that was pretty much the consistency of our phone call, unfortunately. Yeah. So when October rolled around, our social worker told us, Oakley's going to start transitioning home. Eric and I went down to Grays Harbor and we had a meeting with the social worker and her supervisor. And basically I pulled up this whole list of all of Jordan and Andrew's arrest records, faults as parents. We brought up that where are they going to go? They don't have a house. They don't have jobs.
They didn't have a job. And the social worker said poverty is not a barrier to having children. But it wasn't obviously not a barrier to reunite her. They didn't have to have a job. They didn't have to.
Right. And we understand. We're not saying that being in poverty or being homeless is a reason to lose your children. But what we are saying is it doesn't make any sense to take a child out of that and put them into a bad place. And that's where we were very confused. And we left that meeting with just being told, she's not your daughter. And that was really hurtful to us. But what was even more hurtful is we were given the timeline that January 2020 is what we were looking at.
Do it after the holidays.
After the holidays. But then all of a sudden it was November. Very quick. Now, Oakley had never spent the night with her parents. So all of a sudden she was having full weekend visits with her parents, unsupervised visits with them. And then before she returned home with them in 2019, she had 2 weekends where she'd spent the night with them permanently. That's a lot of change for a 2-year-old, almost 3-year-old. And I can't explain how, if that was like really hard for us, I can't imagine what it felt like for Oakley. And she had come home several times and told us that she was there for too long, that she wanted to come home.
Yeah.
And
Oakley Carlson's life, though tragically short, has become a symbol of something much larger than herself. A symbol of the children who are too often forgotten, neglected, or failed by the very systems meant to protect them. Her story, one of love and loss, has sparked a movement that refuses to let her memory fade into the background, where so many other children have been lost. Oakley's face, her laughter, her innocence, these are not just fleeting memories, they are a call to action. They are a reminder that, in the fight for children's rights and safety, there is still so much work left to do. Her legacy lives on, not in the justice she was denied, but in the fight that continues in her name. Oakley has become the face of a broken system, a system that failed her, failed to protect her, and ultimately allowed her to slip through the cracks. But her story is not just one of tragedy, it is a call to reform, a call to action for every child who has ever suffered in silence, for every child who has ever been sent back into harm's way, and for every child who has been ignored by those who were supposed to care for them. Jamie and Joe, Oakley's foster parents, have continued their fight for justice, not just for Oakley, but for every child who has ever been failed by the child welfare system. They have fought for Oakley's law, for reforms to protect children from being returned to unsafe homes, and for a system that truly prioritizes the safety and well-being of children above all else. They have fought to ensure that Oakley's name will not be forgotten, that her memory will not fade into the shadows, and that her story will continue to be told. But as the fight for justice rages on, the haunting question remains, where is Oakley now? What happened to her? Is she out there, somewhere, still waiting for someone to find her, or has she been lost forever? These questions, unanswered and painful, will continue to echo through the hearts of those who loved her. For Jamie and Joe, the unanswered questions will never go away. They will carry them for the rest of their lives, along with the memories of the little girl who stole their hearts.
On December 6, 2021, Oakley turned 5 years old. And I remember that day, I was at lunch and I was going through my photo albums so I could make like a little blurb about her on my Instagram posts. And it kind of made me in my feels. So a couple hours later, I was doing my observation with our principal, which he was a new principal at the time. And I just burst into tears in his office. I explained to him, he didn't know Oakley. He didn't really know like the whole situation, but I explained to him, I'm really sorry. Today's just a tough day for me. And, it's her 5th birthday and I can't stop thinking about her. And he was like, hey, I understand. Like, I hope you get to see her again. And while this is happening, while we're meeting, my phone is kind of going off quite often. We were supposed to have a dance team banquet that night. So I figured it was just probably parents calling and asking me what they needed to bring or what they needed to do. But it was actually Grace Harbor County Sheriff's Office, as well as the Grace Harbor DCYF calling me. So when I checked my voicemail, I had 2 voicemails, one from a social worker asking me if I could take Oakley's little brother and Oakley once they found her. And also the Grace Harbor County Sheriff's Office asking me if I had seen Oakley, which was like, no, I haven't seen Oakley. I, of course, run over to Eric's classroom, which was right next door to mine. And I feel like we jumped around and like celebrated the idea that Oakley was coming back to us. Yep. And then I called my dad and I told him to sit down and he was so excited. And then like the kind of panic set in of, we're getting a toddler, a 5-year-old, and it's her birthday, and I still have a dance team banquet that night, so kind of craziness. I'll never forget, though, when the little brother was dropped off with us, he was in a Monsters, Inc. onesie and rubber boots, and he was dirty.
It looked like he had a play date outside and just rolled around in the dirt and just was not even had his face wiped or anything.
Yeah, no. So that was really a traumatizing night. I don't think either of us slept. Anybody slept in the whole house. And then the next day we went to Target to go get him clothing because he didn't have any clothes. We got him just a ton of outfits and I'm in the toy aisle and I get a call from my friend and she's like, hey, did you know that Jordan and Andrew are currently in court for manslaughter? Which I thought, oh my gosh, like they killed somebody. No wonder why their kids were in hiding. Then she was like, no, it's for Oakley. Like they killed Oakley. And I'll just never forget basically running out of Target, throwing up, and then talking to the detective and him saying, yes, it's just a holding pattern right now. We're investigating. And then I still have never heard from Washington, DCYF. They've never called me and said, Oakley is missing. My last text to the social worker is when I asked her if a queen bed would be okay for Oakley, and the social worker just responded with, "We'll cross that bridge when we get there." So I've never been like formally told that Oakley is missing, possibly dead. So good job, Washington DCYF.
Yeah.
You know, after that, it was too difficult to parent and grieve. So Eric and I talked about it, and we decided that it wasn't in his best interest if we continued to be his parents, because we knew that we couldn't.
We weren't in the right mind space to take care of ourselves, let alone a
2-year-old, who needed a lot of help.
He did, and then unbeknownst to us, another family member stepped up to take him into their care. So a social worker showed up a day or two later and picked him up and took him then.
It's 48 hours I don't think we'll ever be able to forget.
Yeah.
Ever.
The truth about Oakley's fate may never fully come to light, but her legacy is undeniable. She has touched countless lives and inspired a movement that demands change. The fight for Oakley's justice is not just about finding answers for her. It's about ensuring that no other child is subjected to the same pain and neglect that Oakley endured. It's about creating a world where children are protected, valued, and never forgotten. And so, as we reflect on Oakley's legacy, we must remember that her story is far from over. It's a story that continues to unfold, one that challenges us to do better, to be better, and to fight harder for those who cannot fight for themselves. Oakley's life, though stolen too soon, has made an impact that will last a lifetime. Her memory lives on in every person who has been moved by her story, in every voice that has risen to demand change, and in every heart that continues to fight for justice. Now it's time for all of us to take action. Share Oakley's story. Raise awareness. Push for justice. Let her memory live on in the actions we take to make sure no other child suffers the same fate. Oakley's legacy is one of love, strength, and resilience. Let's honor that legacy by ensuring that her story is never forgotten and that the fight for children's safety and rights continues. The time for change is now. The time to protect our children is now. And Oakley's memory will be the spark that lights the way.